So my name is Marco Miradercole. I'm from the OECD Statistics Directorate. It is my pleasure to be here, and many thanks for the colleagues from the IMF and Bundesbank for the invitation. Paul Schreier was originally envisaged as chair of this session. He's taken up by a last-minute commitment. But I have to say that I'm very pleased to be here because, I mean, the issues to be discussed in this session are at the very heart of much of my work at the OECD. Let me take advantage of my position as chair to say a few words about OECD work in this field. Now, the OECD, as many other analysts and statisticians, we have typically looked at household material condition through the prism of household income. We had an established data collection that we undertake every year, covering all OECD countries, based on the surveys that is deemed, on the source that is deemed to be best comparable across countries. But of course, household income is only one facet of material living standards. In 2009, the Stiglitz-Senft Commission provided two recommendations that were highly relevant for the direction that our work took in this field. They first recommended to look at household consumption and wealth alongside income. And second, they recommended to try to look at these things jointly together, to have a sense about the joint distribution of the various aspects of material living standards. The way the organization responded to this initiative was by convening an expert group in 2010 that gathered some of the statistical offices we've experienced in this field and some of the agencies, such as the colleagues from the Bank of Italy, from the ECB, and the Federal Reserve Board. And this group delivered two main products. One was a set of guidelines on the measurement of household wealth and its distribution. It is an expanding field of research, but I think it is probably fair to say that it stays today from a statistical point of view where statistical income distribution were 20 or 30 years ago. No statistical standard exists to guide data collection, and only around half of OECD countries have ongoing surveys and collection in the field. So we released a set of guidelines which carry some weight, although they are not standard in the sense of being approved by the Statistical Commission, the UN Statistical Commission. They are discussed by our Committee on Statistics, and this guidelines provide recommendation on the scope of measurement, the unit of data collection, the unit of analysis, a measurement framework for organizing information available, suggested breakdown for various assets and liabilities, and for the type of household for which information is recorded. And we have been using these guidelines as a basis of a new data collection that we are now undertaking that covers today around 20 OECD countries and that gather information on the distribution of household wealth. The second deliverable of this group was a framework for statistics on the distribution of household income, consumption, and wealth, whose goal was very much to maximize the coherence of the measurement in the three dimensions in the perspective of a unified accounting framework. And Chris will be saying something about this in his presentation. More generally, I think we have also tried to respond to a strong demand for increasing the timeliness of information available in this field. So we have taken inspiration from a recent dashboard developed by the UN, by the Office of National Statistics of the UK, and that gather information, quarterly data on household economic well-being in four domains: income, confidence, consumption and saving, debt and net worth, and labor market. And secondly, we have also pursued a longer-term project, which is part of the G20 Data Gap Initiative, which aims to reflect distributive information within the household sectoral account of the national accounts. So this is some of the ways in which we have taken, developed new initiative in this field, which is a broad one and complex. And so we are talking about some of the statistics that are probably the most difficult to collect. We have a very qualified set of speakers to take them up. I would suggest to go on the order of the agenda. So I invite first Professor Chris Sampatarak. I'm sure I didn't pronounce it correctly, but I hope it is a close approximation. Yeah. From the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. I hope you could keep this. We have 2 presentations to give them 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we will be followed by the 2 discussants. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. One of the good things of being in the last session is that I don't have to motivate why microdata is important, right? Because by this time we all agree that it's important. So this presentation is going to be about an example, right? How that illustrates how important microdata is, and the example is going to be about how we can use microdata to inform policymakers about well-being of the household. So that's going to be the presentation. Okay. So of course, we talked about this yesterday, right? That we need distribution, right? So it's not mean and median may not be enough anymore, because now when we would like to look at the impact of universal or even targeted interventions, either that could be policy or shocks, we may be interested in the impact on particular groups rather than the mean or the median household. And when we think about well-being of the household, of course, there are so many measures that we can look at, but the most common one that people look at is consumption, right? But consumption alone is not enough, as we just listen, right? So we need to understand more on the integrated framework, how consumption is determined as well, right? So two integrated frameworks that I'm going to present today, one is developed by myself and my colleague Rob Towson, that we use financial accounting to understand household finance. And the other one is the OECD one, the Income, Consumption, Wealth Integrated Framework. So I'm going to spend some time working on my framework and then discuss OECD framework. And at the end, the conclusion is that even though we look at the issue from different motivation at the beginning, we kind of like converge into something very similar, and there's room for gain from trade that we can learn from each other. So the approach that I developed with Rob Towson several years ago, basically that stemmed from the need that we have to study household survey, data from household survey. And of course, people say it's easy, right, household consumption, but when you look at the data, consumption is not that easy. What we mean by consumption, what we mean by income. And then that got us into this study. So the framework summarized in this chart or circle. So we think that with household, it's not just household that we learn in Econ 101, right? Household is not just only the unit that purchase input provide input and then purchase output for consumption. But household also produce, and in that sense, this analogy between household and corporate firms. And once we draw that analogy, we can apply the concept of frameworks in corporate financial accounting and corporate finance to study household finance, and that's what we did. So households start with some asset, the red one, and they use asset in their production activity that generate income. That's the blue one. And once they get income, they can use part of that to consume, the green one, right? And then part of that is going to saving that goes back to asset. But of course, household could finance the investment in asset, finance the production and consumption from resources they do not own, which is the part that financing comes in the middle. And with this, you're going to see that these four factors, asset, investment, production, consumption, and financing, are going to be at the core of the study of household finance. For the OECD approach, that, as Marco said, is from top right, we want to see distribution of well-being, basically consumption, but you can consume of your income or wealth. So OECD framework try to draw the relationship between these three things: wealth, income, and consumption. Okay. So let me go over my approach very fast. Okay, so that approach basically got published in this book in Economic Society monograph in 2009, available on Amazon. It's still available, so if you would like to buy. I think it's on discount right now before Thanksgiving. So this one, we apply a framework in corporate financial accounting to study household and create accounts, financial statements for each household for each period. And there are three main accounts in corporate financial accounting: balance sheet, income statement, and statement of household. And basically, those are what we are going to do. Okay. So again, when you look at household, so the right panel, that's the balance sheet, right? You have asset of the household that range from cash, financial asset, all the way to fixed asset. And those assets could be financed by liabilities or household owned wealth or net worth. And then household use that asset in production activity that generate revenue. That's the top line in the income statement. Once you subtract related expense from revenue, you end up with the bottom line, which is net income. So net income for corporate firms, part of net income is going to be redistributed to shareholders in terms of dividend. Right? For household, it's similar. Net income is going to be distributed to shareholder of the household, which is household members, and that comes in the form of consumption. So in a sense, consumption is parallel or analogous to dividend in corporate finance. The remaining of the net income is going to be saved, and that add back to wealth on the right-hand side of balance sheet. And at the same time, that saving has to be invested in some type of asset, which add to the left-hand side of the balance sheet, and you have the balance sheet that is balanced again, which is what we want. Okay. So how to construct this financial statement from in practice? So we start with the survey, but pretty much you can do this with administrative data as well, if you have planned to collect that data in the first place. So we start with initial survey that you ask questions about the stock of asset and liabilities of the household, so you get the initial balance sheet, and then you conduct resurvey and ask for activities or transactions that happen since the last interview or the last survey. And then you update balance sheet and then get income statement and statement cash flow, and you keep going on and on. And at the end, you have the panel of these three financial statements. So for example, this is like the easiest example that I can come up with. So the questionnaire might ask, what is the total amount of cash payment you received since the last interview from doing this job? And this is about the wage income. So once the household answer, that amount is going to go up in terms of cash, is going to be up in balance sheet. At the same time, you record that in income statement and cash outflow in statement of cash flow. Right? But when you record something in income statement, that's going to be recorded as net income as well, and that goes back to cumulative saving in balance sheet. At the end, everything is balanced and everyone is happy. So there are a lot of transactions that you have to think about how to enter into the accounts. I'm not going to go through this in detail. It's almost impossible to read anyway. But some of them are obvious, some of them are less obvious that we can come back at the end. So it's not that once you have accounting framework, it's straightforward. There's still some decision that you have to make. But at the end, you're going to have balance sheet in this one. The top panel is going to be the asset side. The bottom panel is going to be liabilities and wealth. And the asset you can break down by types of asset that the household holds, and the same for liabilities. Similar for income statement, the top part is going to be revenue, the middle part is going to be the expense, and the bottom line is going to be net income that you use part of it to consume, and the rest is saving. And you can create also a statement of cash flow as well. So those are examples. So let me spend some time try to convince you why we think that this framework is helpful. Okay? So the first one is that the accounting framework helps us to better define variables. Because many times when we design survey or we use the data, if you don't have clear idea on what you mean, sometimes that's kind of like murky. Right? For example, the living standard measurement study surveys by the World Bank ask in a month with average sales, how much have you spent in total on the purchase of input, blah, 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 right? So the issue is that when you read this question, both the household and the use of the data and the user of the data have some issues, right? Whether inputs received for free included in this question, in this answer or not, How about the use of input purchased in earlier year and was kept in inventory and you just draw from inventory to use? How about inputs derived from other production activities within the same household and household or labor and so on and so forth? The same thing for output that you produce and you have not yet sold and you put in inventory or you eat by yourself. So these kind of questions basically is very important how we define the variables correctly and consistently, and accounting framework help that quite a lot. And on top of that, you can categorize the many sub-items and so on. But in my opinion, one of the benefit of financial statements that we have is that when you have financial statements, they have to reconcile, right? If they're not reconciled, then there's something wrong. Right? So three financial identities that usually we have is household asset at the end must be equal to household liabilities plus household wealth. An increase in household wealth that you observe in the balance sheet on the right-hand side of the balance sheet must be equal to saving from the income statement. And the net change in cash from statement of cash flow must be identical to the net change in cash that you observe in the balance sheet at the beginning of the period and at the end of the period. Okay? So why I think this one is important? Because with this balance account, we avoid having common problems that a variable generated from one set of questionnaire response yields a different value when computed from an alternative set of responses. For example, Kosher in 2000 studied LSMS survey from the World Bank and found that saving computed as household income minus consumption is actually different from household savings computed from change in household asset. Okay, of course, there are so many reasons why this is different, right? Could be measurement error and so on and so forth. But it could be that in the questionnaire, they didn't give comprehensive list on the type of asset that the household holds. Right? So at the end, you don't get the total change in asset. But more important, part of the change in asset, for example, the increase in asset, could be financed by debt and not household saving. Okay? So if you have financial account framework in mind, then that's kind of obvious, right? Because we just say that change in, saving is going to be identical to change in wealth, but not asset. Because part of the asset is going to be financed by debt. Okay, so asset and wealth are not going to be the same. And then once you have the account, you can use it very easily. You can do financial analysis, like what people in financial accounting use, right? Compute ROA, ROE as the rate of return, look at capital structure, liquidity management, risk management, and wealth management. That's very straightforward. Or you can use that financial statement as the input for your analysis, economic analysis and modeling, right? Study productivity, entrepreneur, financial constraint, payout policy, risk return, and misallocation, and so on. Okay. And you can, once you have the same framework for household, self-employed enterprise, and large corporation, then you can compare, and then you can add up and see the contribution to GDP, which is the total value added. So next, I'm going to present some example of the use of household statement. Okay, and this is perfect because I'm going to present the use of this, the application of financial statement to study household finance in developing countries, and then I think, and this is from household survey, and I think Luigi will present more on the use of administrative data to study household finance in more developed countries. So the example that I'm going to draw in this presentation is from the 1000 Thai monthly survey, which is the monthly survey started in 1998 and still ongoing. Okay, 4 provinces in Thailand. So they're not nationally representative, but they're going to give you a sense on what we can learn about rural household in developing industrialized economy. So we start with the first one, we look at wealth. Of course, this one we just draw one of the line items from the balance sheet, right? So I plot two charts, one at the beginning of the survey in 1999 and the other one in 2012. And what you can see from this, just the simple histogram, is that household in this sample, basically they accumulate wealth, but at the same time, the distribution of wealth also become more equal, right? Shift to the right, okay? Similar trend is observed for income, like income distribution tend to be more equal and households tend to make more money over time during these 12 years. But when you plot this together, okay, wealth and income, the correlation, even though it's significant, is not that high. It's 0.25, and that's the scatter plot. So the top left quadrant over there, basically those are the households that actually have low wealth but generate high income. And that reflects what we call the non-material wealth, which is human capital. Right? So those are going to be important. And what is more important is that even though those households generate high income, they haven't saved a lot in order to catch up and move to the first quadrant yet. Okay? So that could be in the transition period. And we see the convergence that households with low initial wealth have higher growth rate of wealth. Okay? And of course, with that, this confirmed with the Gini coefficient, the inequality has been going down, and that's computed by wealth per capita, even though it's still high. Okay? But when you look at consumption, inequality is much lower and move around like 0.3. National average would be about 0.4 something because we have also inequality across region. Okay? So this one gives you another example how versatile the microdata is, right? Because you can break down by region, and this one you can see that wealth inequality in the more developed central region has been much higher than wealth inequality in the northeast rural area. So when you move on to consumption, this one I put consumption and income together, and I compute coefficient of variations. And it shows that there exists consumption smoothing. Okay? The variations of income, the top panel, is much higher than the variations of consumption in the lower panel. Even though we don't know from this chart alone how households share risk of smooth consumption. That's going to be something that you use the data, take into economic model, and study in more detail. The last chart that I'm going to show is about the use of debt. So this one plots the histogram of the leverage computed as debt to total asset of the household straight from the balance sheet. And it shows that the use of debt remains limited to certain households. And this household actually rely a lot on gift and saving, especially in cash. Okay? And why this is interesting, because this is going to affect like the way you think about macro policy, right? When you think about interest rate policy, how that's going to affect household differently because they have different leverage. Or when you think about household debt in terms of stability policy, you have to look at this household like differently because they're not going to be the same. Okay? So with this, you can use this data and the sky's the limit, right? You can use this to study a lot of things. Household financial account allow us to study the extraordinary lives of seemingly ordinary households. And in the past 10 years, we have been using this data in so many projects, study so many financial household finance issue of the household financial life, financial analysis, cash management, loan management, because a lot of them use bridge loan, right? Wealth accumulation, risk and return, diversification, investment, and so on. So there's so many things that you can use from this data. The same thing that corporate finance literature use corporate financial accounting to study firm behavior. So before I end my presentation, let me briefly discuss a little bit about the OECD integrated framework and how we see the relationship between this framework and the household financial accounting that I and Rob Townsend have been using. So OECD framework, if you read the manual, it's very big. So I spent a lot of time trying to read it. Very impressive. But I summarize everything into one simple framework right here. OECD framework cares about three main things: wealth, income, and consumption. So you start with initial wealth at the beginning, and then you look at the resource that flow into the household. And those include income and non-income transfer. So that's the incoming resource. And then you look at resource paid out of the household. And those include consumption and other transfer. And at the end of the period, you have end of period wealth. So that's a very simple framework summarized into this diagram. So how to put this together, like the two frameworks that I present today. So the framework that I and Rob Townsend used, the Household Financial Accounting, basically that was motivated by from the need to define and measure variables from household micro-survey, and we developed that. From OECD, it was developed because of the need for the data on distribution of household consumption, income, and wealth at the micro level that you cannot get at the aggregate data. Right? So at the end, you get these two frameworks, and you can go back and forth between the two. Okay? But they're not exactly the same, so there's still a gain from trade that we can learn from each other. From OECD, even though you have a lot of income on wealth consumption and income, on the wealth side is a little bit separate when you look at asset and liabilities in the framework. And then from my approach, basically we start from bottom up, from micro. So basically, I think we can learn on how to build this and aggregate up into more of the aggregate one. Okay. So final discussion, 3 questions that I think that you might want to ask, and I will give you answer right away. The first one is whether household financial accounts are useful for household in both advanced and developing economies. Is it only useful for urban? Is it also useful for urban household or household without business enterprise? And my answer is that yes, it's important. It doesn't matter what type of household you are, where the household is located. The household financial accounting framework is universal. What you have to change is just the type of income, the line item, right? The expense and financial instrument that they use. But the framework is pretty much the same. The second question is that when you look at the example I put there, it is scary, right? That we have to create all of those accounts, balance sheet, income statement, and statement of cash flow. Do we really need to construct a panel of this complete household financial statement? And the answer is not necessary. It depends on your study. Right? You might need just some variables, and you can identify those variables like nicely. You don't have to create the whole thing. But in many studies, these variables are so related. Right? So you might need the integrated framework. Otherwise, you cannot understand the story of household finance completely. And the last question that I throw here is whether if we do not plan to construct household financial account, do we have to care about household financial accounting concepts? And my argument is that yes, even though you don't need to construct the full, complete financial account, you still need this accounting concept because it helps you define variables more clearly and consistently, and that allows you to better design questionnaire and avoid confusion, double counting, or missing questions. Okay. So I present something to you, and that looks so simple, right? And the same for the OECD account. But when you try to think about this, it's not that simple, right? There are a lot of issues that you have to make decisions, and there's trade-off on decision that you have to make. Sometimes you want your definition to be more consistent with system of national account. Sometimes you want to deviate from that because it serves you more for the user in terms of like use. So a lot of issues that you have to think about, and they're not straightforward on how you enter each transaction into the accounts. Like non-separability, like how you separate household activity from production activity. For example, you use a pickup truck both for production and consumption, right? Drive your kid to school and also deliver goods. Gift and transfer in national account that could be counted as, say, non-factor income. But in development economics and a lot of issues in household finance, somehow gift and transfer are counted more of the financing rather than the income side. Okay? In-kind transaction, contingent claims is always a nightmare, how you value that, right? Including pension as well, insurance, gambling. Right? It's not obvious whether that's income or change in asset and so on. Intangibles and timing and frequencies. So there are a lot of things that we still have to work on this. That more and more financial instruments that households have access, and a lot of them are not going to be fit into the typical framework. Sometimes you have to rely on corporate financial accounting framework, because they already have thought a lot about that already, like how you treat stock options, right? Those kind of things. That's not simple at all. But at the end of the day, it's all about measurement. Because if you cannot measure, your knowledge is just meager and unsatisfactory. Thank you very much.
So many thanks, Chris, for staying the time and for referring to the OECD framework. I mean, to some extent, no, there are some differences, mainly on the fact that you are focusing more on the production side, which is missing from the OECD framework that you showed. But I think, no, more than those differences, I think that the point to take away from the presentation is the feasibility of collecting coincident information on income, consumption, and wealth from a single instrument, which is something that not all OECD experts participating in our group were convinced as they engaged. I suggest we move to the second speaker, Luigi Guiso. He's AXA Professor of Household Finance and Insurance at the Einaudi Institute of Economics and Finance in Rome. And I think will be a good complement to the presentation by Chris, because it's focusing very much on specific issues, which is about the potential for administrative data as a source for this information. So Luigi.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk to this audience. So what I'm going to do is to stress more the value of administrative data and the potential of administrative data for the study of households' behavior. But I will put it in perspective and say something about the relative advantages of surveys and administrative data. I think there has been definitely massive progress in understanding what households do and how they behave. And a number of important questions, I think they found, to some extent, an answers. For instance, what type of conceptual framework seems to fit best household behavior in several domains, including, whether they behave according to the life cycle, to the standard life cycle model. There has been a huge debate on how much they conform and how much households depart. Whether they behave according to Merton's principle when they allocate their assets between risky and safe securities, and whether they follow the typical recommendation of risk management models when they have to choose the type of mortgage, a fixed rate or an adjustable rate mortgage. Secondly, I think we know much more about the macroeconomic implications of the micro behavior of these households and how they can inform policy. So we know better about the implication of microeconomic behavior of the households for saving patterns and saving dynamics within countries. And we can rely on households' micro behavior in order to try to predict bankruptcy, and even more so to try to get measures which are relevant nowadays for aggregate financial fragility. There has been also a number of successful outcomes, and probably the study of the aggregate implications of household microeconomic behavior has been one of the most fertile areas of research in the past 20-25 years. And in fact, it is worth stressing that the year Nobel Prize was awarded to Angus Deaton, which is, in a sense, is the founding father of this area, or is definitely the person that most has been revamping this area of research. And the key ingredients are here heterogeneity across households in the way they behave, and with it, issues of aggregation. And in a sense, when you look at it, there is no room for representative agents. And as Angus Deaton was putting it, representative agents have two great failings. They know too much and they live too long. We know that we are very ignorant and unfortunately we live too short. And so, you know, when you try to aggregate individuals that are extremely heterogeneous along you know, the knowledge dimension and the lifetime dimension, this aggregate thing is unlikely to behave like, you know, the representative agent model that economists use in the textbook. So I think that a good chunk of progress that is also valuable from a policy perspective in the future will come when this aggregation issue will be taken very seriously. And this is possible because one can or is more possible today because one can rely on the plentiful and informative macroeconomic data that are more easily accessible. Now, there is a two-way interaction between you know, the study of microeconomic behavior and the availability of data. On the one hand, this detailed study of household microeconomic behavior has been made possible thanks to the fact that this data have become available, much more easily accessible. You know, over the past 20, 30 years, there has been a massive gathering of survey data, probably due to much lower collection costs, also through the internet. Also because of the increased commercial value of microeconomic information for households and for firms as well. And also because of the increased policy importance of knowing what are the distributive effects of government interventions and macro policies. But secondly, I think the greater availability has revived the microeconomic research in households' behavior. So the fact that these data are available encouraged, you know, the study of other dimensions that previously were sort of ignored. I must say that, you know, this being said, there has been, you know, we are probably now at a turning point in the sense that we are assisting at a sort of revolution that is coming from the massive availability of administrative records. So as the post-war period was the age of time series, the past 25 years have been the age of household surveys, but probably now we are sort of starting a new age, which is the age of administrative records. You know, administrative records are the combination of different data sets that are collected for other purposes, like, you know, social security data. They are needed in order to manage the social security system. But clearly, once the information is there, you can use it for other purposes, and particularly for research. And once you assemble all this data, you can come up with a good picture of several dimensions of the households and their components. On several dimensions, some are economic, some others are non-economic. But if you want to understand household economics, you need to get a relatively broad picture of dimensions that are not directly, you know, economic, in the sense that it's not enough to know about consumption, income, and wealth if you want to understand consumption, income, and wealth. Okay. So there are several drivers, I would say, of this sort of call it revolution in quotes. There has been an upward trend in the use of the administrative records for research in several countries. And for instance, one very diffused type of administrative data set that has been used in several places, the matched employer-employees data. It is available in countries like Italy, Germany, France, Portugal, and many others. And you can do a lot of stuff. You can study, for instance, how much insurance firms provide to their workers. You can study issues of human capital accumulation, unemployment transitions, and so on. Another example is the matched households, loans, or portfolio in bank data sets. They are available in countries like Italy, in Germany, in Argentina. You can study lending patterns, portfolio allocations, look at quality and distortions in financial advice. There has been, secondly, an expansion of the type of administrative records, not merely data on income or sometimes consumption or wealth, but also information on military, on education, on IQ from the military, on banks and financial institutions, on health records, and I will mention later on genetics. And there's been also an increase in the mergeability of these data sets, thanks to the organization of the administration of the government, availability of a generalized social security code or a tax code that allows to link these various data sets. So one can get really, a very comprehensive picture of a household. This is not true everywhere, but it's sort of specialized across countries, and the Nordic countries are leaders in this respect. They are a sort of benchmark. They are precursors. They started earlier, and they are, in a sense, better organized. Or they sort of understood how to best exploit this information. Records in these countries, typically, they cover the whole population. Merging is essentially doable for almost all data sets that are available. You can trace members of the family. That is, you can link parents to their kids, even when kids live outside of the family. And this is important when you do household studies. And the coverage is very broad. You can get information on income, you can get information on assets, you can merge these data with the firms the workers in the household work form. You can get information on mortality, on health, on casualty, on genetics, and on lotteries. I will mention these later. And of course, you can get information on demographics. Is there something missing from this wealth of data? And I could say yes. And typically what is missing is what is in people's heads. That is beliefs, preferences, opinions, all this stuff that needs, it's not something that you can get typically from administrative records. That is something that you need to elicit, and Charles Mansky has been doing a lot of work on this. Now, this is not irrelevant; it's important because what households do typically often depends on what they think, what are their views, what are their expectations, especially when it comes to consumption decisions, asset allocations, and so on. And also sometimes. What is not in the specific interest of the administration that gathered the data? Remember that administrative records are collected with a specific purpose that is functional to the administration that is gathering the data. So sometimes, for instance, demographic information is scarce. In social security data, you do not have information on education. Now, that is not a problem if you can resort to another data set that has that type of information, you can merge it. So if you can merge all data sets, then you can overcome lots of these problems, but this is cumbersome, even in the most administrative records-prone country like Norway or Sweden. So surveys usually give you a comprehensive picture. Why are administrative records important? What are their sort of comparative advantages? They are important because they can solve or at least attenuate for problems that plague household service. The first one is measurement error. So typically, that is not literally true that administrative records are free of measurement error. There are types of measurement error that belong also to those data sets. But typically, you know, the standard type of measurement errors that are present in household survey are absent in administrative records. There is no attrition when you look at the whole population. Attrition is people that, you know, exit the sample for their choice, and typically that is not random. In population data, there is attrition because people die and people leave the country, but that is the only reason why you have attrition, almost. Sample size and representativeness. So sometimes you need very large data sets for some purposes. You need you know, representativeness of the sample. In administrative records, typically the issue of non-response is not a problem because all the population has to be recorded. Tails. When you are interested in the tails, particularly the very wealthy, this is a problem in household surveys. The wealthy are not sampled in household survey. As far as I know, Bill Gates is not surveyed in the survey of consumer finances. And even if you try hard, I think it's very difficult to have him agreeing to respond to all those questions. In the administrative records, everyone is there, including Bill Gates. Underreporting is not typically an issue, whereas it is an important problem in the surveys. So these problems, as I said, are present almost always, though not necessarily all of them, and not necessarily to the same degree in all surveys. Now, for some issues, they are not necessarily you know, relevant, but for others, they can be critical. Like, for instance, if you're interested in understanding the behavior of the wealthy, you need to have the wealthy in the sample. Some of these problems, however, have grown in importance. And service quality has, over time, has deteriorated. There is an interesting paper in the last issue of the Journal of Economic Perspective that is discussing and documenting some of these features. For instance, there has been an upward trend in non-participation in household surveys, probably because, you know, people are overburdened. If you start asking people to participate in one survey, they may be willing to do so, but, you know, the cost of participation in the second is going up and so on. And so at the end, you know, it's like when you receive all the telephone calls asking you to answer telephone surveys. I answer one, but I'm not going to answer the second because it's too costly. Now I'm going to give some examples. I don't know I'm going to cover all of them that, you know, essentially are just examples of how one can use administrative records and why they can be, what is their potential and why they can be useful. And I will you know, discuss a little bit portfolio diversification and wealth inequality, which is a super topical issue today. I will discuss also a little bit how one can use these administrative records in order to identify the causal effect of changes in wealth, and discuss a little bit lifetime accumulation and how household behavior, how they manage their portfolio allocation over the life cycle. Let me start with the portfolio diversification. Now, Diversification is hard to measure in the sense that to do it properly, it requires knowledge of all single assets that belong in the portfolio of the individual, in particular risky securities. You need to know, to do it properly, each single stock that enters the portfolio. And secondly, you need to be able to link these portfolio holdings to the time series of return of each single asset. Now, if you ask in a survey, this is almost impossible to get. People don't know whether they have a Fiat stock or a Volkswagen stock or whatever. If they know, they don't know the denomination. And so, in order to do this merge of the price information on the asset holding, you need to know the ISIN code for the financial instrument. So this is not doable in a proper way in using a survey. But it's available in Sweden for the whole population. Okay, so the Sweden has a tax on wealth, had a tax on wealth, and for that they collected each single instrument that households have in their portfolio, and you can merge the instrument with the price information, and then you can look at portfolio diversification. So this is a picture of how far individuals are from the straight line, which is where they should be if they were perfectly diversified. So you see that a big number of individuals are far away from full diversification. Second example, wealth inequality. What happens at the top of the wealth distribution? Is there a trend? This is the topic of much research today after Thomas Piketty's book. But wealth at the top is very hard to measure, and typically surveys miss individuals at the very top of the wealth distribution. Now, one alternative that has been pursued recently by Emanuel Seitz and Zuckman is to use tax records on income from capital, and then you capitalize this income from capital divided by an average rate of return. Now, tax records are available for the whole population in most countries. And so you can infer the value of the wealth just taking the income from capital and dividing by a rate of return. Well, this is a problem. The problem is that if there is heterogeneity across individuals in returns to income, to capital, this procedure is going to inflate the amount of inequality. How can we validate whether that procedure is reasonable or not? You can do that if you use Norwegian data. In Norway, you have information on income from capital, and you observe the true wealth of the individual. So this picture, the dark line here on the left-hand side, is the actual share of wealth of the top 5% in Norway. It's the true share. The other one is the share that you get if you use the Zuckman and Seitz procedure. As you can see, there are two features. Their measure tends to be inflated. And the amount of error is not trivial. You tend to boost, to overstate the share at the top by something, depending on the year, between 5, 6, and 10 percentage points. And sometimes the trends are different. In the middle part of the sample, between 2000 and 2005, according to their procedure, wealth inequality is increasing. According to the true data, it is going down. The same type of data can be used in a more productive way to try to say something about the debate of what originates wealth inequality. We know that just income inequality is not enough to explain the inequality in wealth. And another possibility is that there is persistent diversity in how good are individuals to extract returns from wealth. That is, there is heterogeneity in returns to wealth. This is a line of research that has been pursued recently, but implies, it rests on the assumption that there is a lot of heterogeneity in returns to wealth. One can use the data in order to document whether that is actually the case. And so, we've been using this data to measure returns to wealth and see how much heterogeneity is there across individuals. And definitely, returns to wealth, they do differ massively across people. And yeah, 1 minute is enough. And not only, they tend to be correlated across generations. Causal effect of wealth. We would like to, there is a huge literature that argues that wealth matters for consumption, for labor supply, for participation in asset markets. So one would like to know whether, if there is a random fall in wealth that is going to trigger, what sort of changes is going to trigger in these important variables, in particular in labor supply, or in wealth, for that matters. But it's very difficult to identify because wealth doesn't accrue randomly. One can do some experiments, but those are typically unfeasible. The only one that pops up to my mind is an helicopter drop of money, right? Randomly here and there. But I would say that the Bundesbank would oppose to that. So exceptions are large lotteries. But you need population data in order to do an exercise of this sort. Now, in Denmark, this is doable. It's possible because they have data set whereby you have the whole population of participants in lotteries, and clearly you observe the winners. Now, this data can be merged, can be linked to administrative records on portfolio holdings, on labor supply, on health, mortality, and fertility. And so wealth shocks are random, and you can look at how this randomness in wealth accruals impacts on behavior. And the finding by Cesarini and his co-authors is that wealth effects seem to be smaller than we thought up to now. Let me mention, again, the research that Cesarini has been doing on genetics. Genetics is an important, potentially important field of study, and in particular, behavioral genetics. But you need the huge data sets in order to pin down, if there is any, the effect of genetics on behavior. Now, in Denmark, it is possible to do that. You can link the population data to the genetic data and solve some of these measurement problems. So finally, let me mention this life cycle portfolio issue. There has been a long debate whether households accumulate risky assets over the life cycle, which is what typically advise or recommend, and theory suggests. Do they rebalance over the life cycle? Now, if you look at survey data, the bottom line of that research is that households don't. That the allocation, the portfolio allocation is essentially flat over the life cycle. But there are reasons to doubt about that conclusion, because essentially of the measurement problems that affect those data. Now, if you use records, administrative records from Norway, you can address that problem. Essentially, to do it, you need comprehensive data that cover all sources of wealth for many years. You need a long panel with no measurement error and details about the portfolio allocation. If you do that, all you see is that households seem to conform to the standard prediction. So the blue line is the portfolio composition, is the asset, is the risky asset share in the portfolio. It is relatively high at a young age, and then they start decumulating it until retirement. So to conclude, I think with these examples, I want to stress the point that we are sort of beginning a new age. In the Nordic countries, the age is already there. It's the age of administrative records that carry a number of statistical advantages. The attenuation of measurement error, the broad coverage, particularly of details, no selection and attrition, no collection costs. They are already there. Now, their exploitation, however, requires some organizational capital. So you need an ID for each individual, and you need the possibility of linking these IDs also to the other members of the family. A final question, is this the end of surveys? I would say no, not necessarily, and at least not everywhere. A lot is collected, as I said, administratively, but not all. Let me stress the importance of information about views, expectations, beliefs, and preferences. And not everywhere, not in developing countries. Developing countries, they have a poor administration, so there are no administrative records. So surveys there, as the previous presentation was arguing, they are important, they are necessary, they are indispensable. So even in developed countries, I think the two should be used in a complementary way. Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi. And maybe let me say that this last point about both the increasing importance of administrative record and more generally of mixed source data is something that we will be confronting, will become very, very important in the future. And the point that, however, no, we should be considering them as complement rather than fully substitute. The point that you were making about developing countries is surely very important. I mean, I was coming back from a conference last week. And one striking element that was put on the floor is that of the 54 African countries, only 8 had so far more than one labor force survey. So there are huge gaps in the availability of survey data in these countries. I think we should continue with our first discussant, Olympia Bover, who is the head of the unit on microeconomic information and analysis at the research division of the Bank of Spain. If possible, we're running a bit late. We have 20 minutes. If we go a bit further than the 10 minutes, we'll eat a bit on the coffee time.
Well, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity of discussing these two papers. In discussing the two papers, the general theme of my discussion would be measuring material conditions of households regarding income, consumption, and wealth. And I will be touching on 4 issues. First, administrative data for this purpose. Second, I will talk about the Euro area coordinated wealth surveys, and I will give an example of international comparability regarding debt outcomes of households. Then I will speak briefly about statistical matching methods, and finally, I will talk about high-frequency surveys. Regarding administrative data, Luigi is right. Administrative data have a huge potential for empirical research and also for developing economic statistics. Administrative data are preferable to surveys along 3 main dimensions. They offer much larger sample sizes needed to study rare events. They have longitudinal dimension, and they provide higher quality information than usually available for surveys. So the research frontier has moved to using administrative data, and striking results have been obtained, as Luigi has shown. Well, often algorithmic and statistical methods for analyzing these data are needed to be developed. So in implementing these administrative data, Nordic countries have pioneered systems to allow access to them for research purposes. For example, Statistics Denmark prepares anonymized data by combining information from administrative databases for approved research projects. So data are accessed by researchers remotely through secure server. And researchers apply for data access through accredited institutions, and they compete on scientific merit. Direct access to microdata is critical for success. Submission of computer programs to agency employees essentially rules out exploratory data analysis. An ingredient of this system is a centralized agency that can obtain administrative data from all government branches, maintain them, and supply them anonymized to researchers. And merging of data is easier in a centralized agency system than in a system with multiple agencies. However, a centralized agency is unlikely to work in the case of decentralized governments with multiple agencies at different levels of government with legal limitations. Citing Card and co-authors, it is less likely to be possible, for example, in the US context, with a long tradition of distrust of centralized government, and in particular of monopoly control by a single government agency. Still, of course, it is possible to develop systems of cooperation, competition in a multiple agency setting, including data merging across different agencies. More generally, it's the issue of trust in government. The confidence of citizens in the actions of their government to do what is right varies substantially across countries, as some OECD material shows. So the distrust of governments affects the ability to implement efficient administrative data access programs. Okay? And trust is also related to data safety, concern about leakages, etc. And, well, the concerns with confidentiality with administrative data may make replicability difficult. And requesting data has become the standard code of conduct in scholarly journals. But of course, these journals increasingly grant exceptions on the grounds of data confidentiality. However, systems to access administrative data should address protocols to facilitate replication. So after talking about accessibility and of this data, let me emphasize the aspects that are unlikely to be in administrative data. Luigi has mentioned them. Time use, consumption, search, work, leisure, home production, childcare, self-reports, health, wealth, adult skills, subjective expectations, as Chuck mentioned yesterday, are very important, so expectations about income, mortality, economic environment. Let me give you an example about house price expectations and consumption in the Spanish survey of household finances. In the Spanish survey of household finances we introduced in 2011, a question on probabilistic subjective expectation about house prices. Why did we do that? Well, one of the main motivations is the importance of real estate in household wealth. In Spain, 80% of the value of household assets is invested in housing, and this is true. The importance of housing is true all along the wealth distribution, not only even in the top decile. One of the main purposes of collecting subjective expectations data is to help understand behavior. So let me show you some evidence on whether house price expectations predict household expenditure decisions. So as I was saying, we introduced this question in the EFF. And the question is as follows. We are interested in knowing how you think, well, it's the translation, okay? How you think the price of your home will evolve in the next 12 months. Please distribute 10 points among the following 5 possibilities, assigning more points to the scenarios you think are more likely. And the scenarios the people were presented with are those 5 ones. A more than 6% drop, around 3% drop, approximately stable, around 3%, more than 6%. Okay? In the Spanish survey of household finances, we also have expenditure questions. In particular, we know whether the household has purchased a car in the last 12 months, how much did it cost, whether it has purchased housing equipment, amount spent on food, and also if it has purchased other housing. So from the question on household expectation I just showed, we just construct 2 very easy dummies. One dummy which shows the location of expectation, very pessimistic household, i.e. a dummy that takes the value 1 for people expecting a large drop with certainty in the price of their house in the next 12 months. And another dummy which just express uncertainty, takes the value 1 for respondents assigning points to more than one option. And because of the availability of a lot of information in that survey, we can control for future income expectation, income shocks in the present year, net wealth, demographic, postal codes, and you name it. What are the results? Well, Households with pessimistic expectations have a significant lower probabilities of buying a house, around 1 percentage point lower, of buying a car, about 4.5 percentage points lower. However, these house price expectations don't correlate with expenditure on other items. And interestingly, greater uncertainty in house price expectations is also associated with lower probability of buying a secondary house of the order of 0.6, 0.8 percentage points. And the results vary with wealth. Other way of using both kind of data is to link administrative and survey data. And it's a way of introducing high quality variables into survey samples, okay? And there is a very nice example in the Econometrica in 2014 where Jimenez et al. Linked debt registers and firm level survey data to disentangle supply from demand factors in the amount of credit, okay? There are another example of complementarities between household surveys and administrative records, okay? And I think, well, I'll skip that because of time constraints. I would also like to mention the European Household Finance and Consumption Survey. This is a Eurosystem initiative aimed at collecting comparable microdata information on income, assets, liability, consumption, and many household characteristics. The first wave was conducted in 15 euro area countries, and the first wave was conducted between 2008-9 and mid-2011. And the second wave has already been conducted, and the results will be soon available. The big advantage of those data is ex ante. They are ex ante comparable data because the questionnaire is common, many sampling things are common, imputation, and so on. So with this data, we have a very powerful mean of comparing across countries comparable groups of people. And the next step, of course, is after comparing these people and seeing the differences, what is the role of institutions behind these differences? Let me give you a very, very quick example. With other colleagues at central banks, we use this data to see the relationship between household characteristics and many debt outcomes. In particular, the probability of holding debt, the amount of debt, and the rate of interest paid by those households for their main mortgage. If you just look at the first panel, it shows you the probability of having debt of a similar group of households in our countries. This group of households is households which are made of a couple, both age 35, 44, both with medium education, both employed, earning the country household median incomes. So that is a group of households with wide support in all EU countries. Well, you can see that the probability of holding debt of these people, and the standard errors are also shown, varies greatly from 12% in Italy to 65% in Spain, and 25% in Austria or Germany. This is also true of the amount of debt relative to income. In Austria, this group of households having debt just hold 150% of debt, and in Portugal or the Netherlands is 350%. Okay? And even interest rates in the monetary union vary for this group of households. Okay? We can see the lower value in Luxembourg, 2.4%, and the higher one in Germany with 4.6%. And these patterns are also different by income. There are huge differences in the rate of interest household in the 90th percentile pay as compared to the households in the 10th percentile in countries like Italy, something like 210 basis points. Okay. So, statistical matching. Statistical matching is discussed in the OECD report on an integrated income, consumption, and wealth framework. There is a long tradition in applied micro of imputing total expenditure from expenditure in a subset of categories using statistical matching. For example, Skinner did that, and Blondel et al. Also applying similar methods. One lesson of this line of work is that average total expenditure for a demographic group is easier to estimate than the variance of other characteristics of the conditional distribution of total expenditure. So what's the best practice of reporting the output of statistical matching procedures when concerned with distributions? If an individual total expenditure is imputed, the presumption is that we have been able to estimate consistently the full conditional distribution. Since typically these will be out of reach, it is a better practice to offer imputes for individual mean total expenditure or individual variances and other characteristics if available. What's the difference? Why I am stressing that? Well, if we had been able really to impute individual total expenditures, a user could meaningfully use the imputed data to calculate a Gini coefficient. However, it would not make sense to do such a calculation from imputed conditional mean total expenditures, whether these are subject to random perturbation or not. Another lesson is that nonlinearities matter in the relationship between expenditure and income. So this problem is a big concern when matching data sets with very different supports, like consumer surveys, which are known not to be answered by the rich people, and wealth surveys that are designed to capture rich households and often overrepresent them successfully, even if Bill Gates is not there. So my last point is about how all these squares also with high-frequency longitudinal household surveys. The framework presented by Chris is an accounting framework for measuring household income and consumption, and is a massive undertaking. And their goal is to impose an accounting framework on household data. And they use high-frequency monthly data. The framework emphasizes the distinction between cash flow measures and measures of performance, which is particularly relevant for rural households in developing countries. In contrast, low-frequency household survey data, like the PSID or the European Household Survey, provide an X-ray of assets, debts, and income over a year, but they are mute about short-term cash flow dynamics that households face. A conceptual accounting framework, like the one described by Chris, may induce a useful discipline in questionnaire design for low-frequency multi-purpose household surveys. But I think that its force, it's in the context of high-frequency surveys. High-frequency surveys, high-frequency data in developed countries would help understand the liquidity of poor households and its implications for wealth accumulation. In contrast, longitudinal low-frequency surveys are important to study life cycle and business cycle aspects of household income and wealth. So again, high-frequency diaries and low-frequency longitudinal surveys provide complementary information. It's my last slide. The use of diaries to track and record household economic behavior has increased in recent years, okay? And there are also examples in the US following Chris and Paul methodology, like the US Financial Diaries Project, etc. Diaries have several advantages over surveys, but they also have their own disadvantages. I'm not going to get into that. And I think an important question high-frequency data should help answer, for example, in developed countries, is whether poor households mismanage their finances due to inadequate financial education, as sometimes thought, or do they suffer from liquidity problems and financial market failure? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Olympia. I think we should move straight to the last discussant, Thomas Alexander, who is Senior Economist at the IMF Statistical Department.
Thank you very much. I think we just got two pretty good presentations with slightly different perspectives on measuring household income and wealth and so forth. Chris's one basically looks at household surveys, in Thailand, emerging market economy, and Luigi's basically looked at it from administrative data, which is another type of data, or from advanced economies. I think they complemented each other quite well. In terms of, okay, it doesn't work. I just want to start by giving you some context to a lot of the work that is going on in terms of measuring income, consumption, and wealth. There's been quite a lot of interest in that area, at least over the past decade, and certainly since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. The G20 Data Gaps Initiative, for example, includes a specific recommendation on measuring household distribution. This was in the first phase. As you notice, I have a number in brackets there, recommendation 16, and in the second phase, recommendation 9. But it's basically the same recommendation. And it reiterates the importance of providing household distributional information alongside aggregate figures such as the sectoral financial accounts and balance sheets of households. Therefore, the work that is taking place or that is expected to take place on measuring household distributional income is actually closely linked to the work on sectoral accounts as we on statistics on a from home to home basis as we discussed yesterday. And if you look at the recommendations, what you'd notice is that the recommendations are basically in sequence. For example, in the first phase, recommendation 15 was the statistics on a from home to home basis, and recommendation 16, statistics on household distributional information. And in the second phase, recommendation 8 is on sectoral accounts, and recommendation 9 is on distributional income. I won't read this, but this basically is the wording of the recommendation. And as you've noticed, the OECD, and as Marco has mentioned, the OECD has basically taken the lead in this area and has given the lead in this area. The OECD has done quite a bit of work on measuring household income, wealth, and so forth. The Better Life Initiative, the work of the OECD expert group on microstatistics on household income, consumption of wealth, and also the OECD has prepared some handbooks on the measurement of income, consumption of wealth as well. There's also interest at the IMF in looking at household distributional income in terms of monitoring job creation and inclusive growth. And in fact, the IMF has provided special surveillance guidance for staff in terms of looking at the effects of IMF policies on job creation and inclusive growth, income inequality, and so forth in member countries. I won't go through that in much detail. If you're interested, it's on the IMF website. It provides information on the surveillance guidance on why the IMF is interested in looking at job creation and inclusive growth and how that is related to IMF policies in general. Okay, it doesn't like me. In terms of the conceptual framework, just to say very, very briefly, a lot of the work, a lot of the extensions that are taking place on measuring household distributional income and wealth and so forth is actually based on the work in the national accounts. There are variations and so forth. There have been expansions, and the SNA has been adapted to look at these issues. But really, the conceptual framework is the system of national accounts. And over the past 25 years that I've been involved in national accounts, I've always, and those of us who work on national accounts, always come up with this issue where there is talk of the limitations of national accounts and the weaknesses of national accounts and so forth. This is more or less a disclaimer of sorts from a national accounts compiler, that national account statistics was never meant to measure well-being and welfare. So it's not a limitation that the fact that it does not measure it. It simply didn't start off with the intention of doing so. And this is made quite clearly in the National Accounts Manual, and even Richard Stone, perhaps the main architect of the system of national accounts, in his Nobel acceptance speech, he alluded to that fact as well, looking at the accounts of society. Basically, the national accounts is an accounting framework of flows and positions, and that is just about it. It does not measure welfare. So if you need to measure things like welfare and so on and so forth, there are extensions. You have the basis in the system of national accounts. You expand it with information from other sources, and it's able to give you some pretty good assessment of welfare and so forth. And this is a lot of the work that OECD is doing on income and consumption and wealth. Am I pressing the wrong button? I will focus basically on the measurement issues. There are lots of issues that are raised in both of the papers, both by Chris and by Luigi, but I will focus more on the measurement issues or the data issues without going much more broadly into these broader issues. I think I may have skipped a slide. Yeah. Now, as we would have realized, measuring the activities of households is actually the most challenging of all entities. For corporations or for government, you have accounting data there, specific recordings of activities. You simply do not have that for households. Therefore, to measure the activities of households, you have to develop special measurement procedures. And Luigi mentions the administrative data revolution, and he provides some framework for advanced economies. I think for us statisticians, or those of us who are engaged in compilation processes, comprehensive administrative data would be our ideal world. But the problem is, because it is cheap, administrative data are cheap, there are basically very low collection costs, and they are potentially very timely. But we do not live in an ideal world. And basically, with administrative data, there are issues that one comes across time and again. One of the key issues that you come across with administrative data is that there are conceptual differences between the administrative data and the underlying statistical framework. One basic example, for example, is the macroeconomic statistics frameworks are basically based on an accrual accounting basis. If you want to look at the use of tax data, for example, in most countries, or in all countries, tax data may be based on a cash basis. So there are these conceptual differences, for example, that one has to take into account when one is looking at administrative data. So it does not necessarily fit precisely how you want it to fit the statistical framework. There is also the issue of matching income with consumption. Income is basically a concept of individuals. When you're measuring income, you basically measure it from the point of view of the individual. When you're looking at consumption, you're looking at consumption from the point of view of the household. How do you match this with administrative data? There are ways of doing that, and I think Luigi mentioned a couple ways, but that may not be relevant across all countries, especially developing countries. One issue that perhaps we can look at going forward, and perhaps we won't have enough time to discuss it now, is the broad examination of administrative data, the use of administrative data in developing countries. There is a perception, perhaps among lots of people, that in developing countries, survey data is so poor, and as Marco pointed out, surveys are pretty sporadic. So you may be able to fill the gap with administrative data. That is not always the case, because in many cases, the administrative data are just as poor as the survey data. There's some unique problems that you find in a lot of developing countries with administrative data. The duplication of records, duplication of even things like tax records and so forth, missing identifiers in the data, missing records, so you cannot have a consistent series from one period to the next. And a non-trivial issue, is the lack of processing capacity. And one may think that is an issue that is easily overcome. In many cases, it simply does not. It's an issue that simply continues, and the administrative data builds up, it is not processed, and at the end of the day, it becomes totally useless. Luigi also mentioned the exploitation of administrative data requires some organizational capital. For example, subjects need an ID at birth linked to their families and so forth. That is quite useful, and in many cases where this is done, there has to be some planning and coordination between the statistical agency and the agency that is involved in compiling the administrative data, where the statistical agencies need to advise on their requirements, and in some cases that is put into the administrative recording. The other side of that is that this also has to be monitored over time. Because if you have a situation where administrative records are simply adapted for statistical purposes, as time goes on, the recording tends to fall through because these information are not needed by the agencies that are involved in providing the data. We see that a lot. That may not be a relevant example here, but we see that a lot, for example, in trade statistics, where you have a situation where the customs is engaged only in revenue, only cares about revenue. So some of the additional information that is needed for statistical purposes, the customs simply does not bother to record it. And this happens across the board with administrative data. Chris builds the household financial accounting model, and it is built basically from the micro level, where he links the micro level to the macro level data. This is sort of the reverse as what is being done in the OECD handbook, recommended in the OECD handbook, where you have the macro framework and the micro links made to this macro framework. So it would be useful to review that and to see how it meshes, for example, with some of the work that the OECD has done, and certainly the household accounts on the S&A accounts on the household sector. It would be useful to look at what are the similarities and differences and so forth, and what are the implications for the household accounts. Are there things that we could learn from what Chris has done, and perhaps things that Chris could incorporate into his household financial accounting framework based on what the work that has been done in the S&A and in the OECD guidelines. So Chris, I'll definitely buy your book at the end of the day. One discussion point that I wanted to just focus on, Chris raised 3 discussion points, but there's one important one, I think, that I just want to extend a bit. And the discussion point is household financial accounting useful for households in both advanced and developing economies? Is it useful for urban households or households without business enterprises? And I think we agree, and Chris agrees, that yes, it is useful. But the issue is not whether or not it is useful, it's whether or not it is feasible. As I said, the recording of household transactions and household stocks and so forth is definitely the most difficult of all entities in the economy. And lots of countries, even the most advanced economies, have issues with this. Chris also raised some of the non-trivial issues, like the measurement of gifts and transfers and in-kind transactions and so forth. These are very important if one wants to look at the contributions to income and wealth. The issue is, how do you measure these items? This has always been a problem in macroeconomic statistics, whether it's balance of payments and so forth. But it is becoming increasingly important. And again, to link back to what was done yesterday on a statistics on a from home to home basis, one of the goals of the measurement of statistics on a from home to home basis is to look at sectors in the domestic economy, for example, with the same sectors or different sectors in the rest of the world. So, for example, looking at sectors in the household sector in one economy with the household sector in another economy, or the household sector in the rest of the world. And looking at issues such as gifts and transfers or transfers between households. This is a pretty important issue. So the issue is not whether or not it's important, the issue is how do you go about measuring that? And that is one of the issues going forward. The other issue is in terms of contingent claims. There has been a lot of discussion in macroeconomic statistics about whether or not contingent claims should be included is a transaction or in the system. And that discussion is going to continue for some time. The issue about contingent claims is that for purposes of consistency in the system and consistent recording across 2 parties, the issue is that if you record contingent claims for one party, what do you record for another party? Does that other party recognize these claims as well, or recognize these contingencies as well? So these are the kinds of issues, again, we could look at going forward. As I said, these were 2 very interesting presentations. Chris, I hope to get your book later on to read up more on it and look at how this meshes with the work that is currently undergoing in other areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, also for having cut short your intervention. I'm looking now to our host. We have exceeded we are eating the time for coffee. If you think we can go on until 11:15, so usually it's 4 minutes, I ask to you for a couple of questions, if it is acceptable for you. So two questions, and then I leave the floor to Chris and Luigi just for a rejoinder, for 1 minute rejoinder. Any question on the presentation from?
A question, and if you allow me, the organizers a minute for publicity for a report of the European Central Bank on households, on the basis of the sector accounts on the 10th of November. The European Central Bank, together with the national central banks in the euro area, have published for the first time a households sector report, and is something in between GDP and the survey and administrative data that have been discussed in this session. So I think that in between GDP and survey and administrative data, to understand the economic and financial life of households, we have something we can extract from the sector financial and non-financial accounts, including the non-financial assets, which are essential because of housing for households. Thank you.
Thank you. Any another question from the floor? If not, let me turn first to Chris if you wanted to react to some of the points raised. 1 minute.
Actually, I just some point, but I think I agree with Luigi that administrative data is amazing, and I start to use some of those data as well. And I like your conclusion that at the end is kind of like complementary, especially for developing countries that a lot of activities are in informal sector, that usually those are not included in administrative data by definition. So I think that's the part that we still have to take care of, and I think that's the only thing I would like to add.
Luigi?
I think I do not have much to add. Just one quick thing. I said that the collection of these administrative records requires some organizational capital. Actually, it requires a lot of organizational capital. For instance, Italy, they passed the law, when was it? Last week, I think, whereby they are centralizing all the demographic information that was collected at the local level. So, you know, in order to, for this strategy of data collection to be practical and to be usable, at least when you look at households, the first thing that you need is to start from the demographic and to have a kind of centralized demographic records. But my impression is that also for developing countries, knowing this, now we know how you know, an administration can be organized. My impression is that they should start from the demographics anyway. I mean, that is useful independently of the collection of households information. But that is a long way. But my impression is that the technology now is much cheaper and, you know, probably feasible also for developing countries to start to set up a proper demographic system.
So let me thank our speakers and discussants for a very useful presentation. On my part, let me just add, maybe pick up on one point that was mentioned in Luigi's presentation about the link of this agenda to macro fragility. I mean, traditionally, you know, the way where people have been engaged in the area of measuring distributions have been from an inequality perspective, social justice perspective. I think there is a compelling case for looking at, for taking very seriously the statistics if you want to see tension building up in the economic system as a whole. One striking thing of the period before the crisis, for example, in the United States, if you simply look at balance sheet data for the household sector, well, you couldn't see much evidence of disequilibrium building up. Basically, you had household debt increasing and inflated asset prices going at the same time. The second point, so I think there is a strong case to be made there. The second, and my last word, is that no, this is an agenda that is not going to go away quickly. Much of the initial drive came from the Stiglitz-Senfi Commission. There is now a follow-up commission where Angus Deaton is one of the members. Walter Rademacher, who is here in the room, is one of the members. The group will release a recommendation towards the end of its report and recommendation towards the end of 2016, and then you can expect much more follow-up discussion and implementation in the months that follow. Thank you very much.